So one other kind of major development that occurs in the early 1960s, particularly around 63, 64, that's worth considering is what we now call the British invasion. And really this is kind of the start of the story about the Beatles. In so many ways the Beatles defined most of the kind of major changes that occur in rock and roll during the 1960s. They kind of charted in a sense. And kind of following their story, I think, is vital to understanding the history of rock. So, the Beatles, they start off, really, the earliest incarnations of the Beatles were in 1957, 1958 in Liverpool. And Liverpool was very much kind of a working town. It wasn't a major industrial sort of area, or it wasn't a major cosmopolitan area. And growing up there, Lennon and McCartney were interested in two particular styles of music. One that was coming from abroad, rockabilly. They were interested in the sounds of Elvis, the sounds of Jerry Lee Lewis, and also the sounds of rock and roll in general. This was exciting music. So, if you look at early pictures of the Beatles, you'll see they have the kind of pompadour haircuts. They're wearing the leather. They're trying to go for that kind of American kind of greaser look. And that was a style that really kind of was an emulation of American rockabilly. The other major influence on the early music is a uniquely British style called skiffle. So skiffle essentially was a kind of folk music, taking a lot of American folk tunes and a lot of American blues tunes and speeding it up and giving a real kind of aggressive sort of quality, a real sort of drive that actually isn't present in American folk music. It's not present in American blues. I'm going to give you a musical example of Lonnie Donegan, who is considered the king of skiffle. And when you listen to him, I mean, it's kind of a real kind of nasally sort of voice. And there's kind of an aggression to his music overall that's really interesting. Well, these two influences, I think, are kind of key for Lennon and McCartney in the early days of the Beatles. And it's right around in 1959, 1960, 1961, they start to move outside of Liverpool, start to gig outside of Liverpool, start to gig all over Europe, and in particular, they end up in Hamburg, Germany. Hamburg, Germany was kind of interesting because it was part of Western Germany at the time, and it was this kind of major cosmopolitan area. It was seen as being the hippest place in all of Europe. The most kind of progressive socially, the most progressive in terms of art, in terms of culture. And it's there that they meet the guy who would eventually become their manager, Brian Epstein. And Brian Epstein essentially convinces them that, look, I mean, you guys have this rockabilly look, this sort of vibe going on, but your music does something else. It kind of goes beyond that, and you guys can be something really unique. And Brian Epstein really motivates them to change their overall look, their overall vibe, and really kind of start to chart their own course relative to some of the other bands that were playing in Hamburg at that time. So here's where they adopt the quote-unquote mop-top haircut, right? Which at the time was considered to be long and shaggy. It was just kind of, just growing the hair out and just cutting it just enough around your face to be shown. He had the guys dress up in very kind of fashion-forward suits. So the early Beatles suits were very kind of tight. Tight pants, tight jackets. In some cases, jackets without the collar, things like that. So very kind of fashion-forward stuff. They were also wearing what people refer to as Beatle boots, which were kind of ankle-length boots that had a heel on them. So these were things that, really made the Beatles stand out relative to other bands performing in Hamburg. So shortly thereafter, they released their very first single, Love Me Do. Now, this single was released first, but it's not until almost, 6 months later that we get their first full-length LP, the long play. And this is a big point that I'm going to want you to remember about the Beatles, is when they start off, they're very much kind of squarely in the camp of kind of early pop music styles, releasing singles, not LPs. And the recordings overall were supposed to be representative of a live performance of the band. What you're hearing is the band playing in the room together. That's what the recordings were supposed to represent. This changes by the time we get into 65, 66. So, in a very short amount of time, they're able to quickly establish themselves throughout Europe as this kind of, unusual looking and unusual sounding band that kind of harkened back to early rock and roll, to the 1950s era rock and roll, which by this point was, 5-6 years in the past. But also these different sort of skiffle qualities to what they do as well. Topped off with a very unusual appearance, a very unusual sort of look to what they had. And we call this whole kind of period the Beatlemania era, where, just like how we had talked about with Frank Sinatra, you have, streams of girls just chasing after them everywhere that they go, screaming loudly whenever they're performing, and not really listening to what they're performing, just screaming at them. And really, I think I would argue it's also because the Beatles represented kind of this unusual unit. Here were four guys who wrote a lot of their own music as a unit. They each kind of represented a different personality, if you will. So you have Paul was the kind of cute, happy-go-lucky one. John was the serious thinker, right? George was the introvert. And then Ringo was the goofy one. He was the silly one. And so if you think about the way a lot of boy bands work, it's very much in this sort of vein, where you have these different personalities represented by each musician. Well, the Beatles were this kind of thing. You have these different personalities, they write their music, and they play their music. In February of '64, a lot of this hype is building up in Europe, and the record label is really trying to push them in the United States. Up until this point, no British bands had really had any success in the United States. It just wasn't happening. Well, the Beatles would be the first major British artist to kind of break in the United States. And they did it with this 9-day tour, part of which included a whole bunch of TV appearances, lots of television appearances. Some were just interviews, which is kind of interesting to think about, that a big part of this kind of initial push had nothing to do with their performances, but was more about kind of selling this idea of the Beatles. One of those television appearances was for the Ed Sullivan Show, and it's amazing. 73 million people turn in. I think it is said to be something like 2/3 of the households in the United States with televisions were watching that particular performance. That's enormous. Nobody gets that kind of viewership nowadays. Nobody. And so, this kind of focus on the Beatles just kind of grows to a fever pitch. Really propels the band into American consciousness. So much so that a lot of the music that was happening at this time period gets very quickly pushed back to the wayside. A lot of the doo-wop music that was happening, a lot of the surf music that was happening gets pushed aside. And you can kind of see that based on not only the amount of records they sold during this time period, but the fact that the top 5 songs for the longest period in American radio charts were all Beatles songs. That's a pretty amazing feat. It very rarely happens nowadays, and hardly ever is it 5 songs. It's maybe 2 or 3. Nowadays, record labels, they release one song at a time to kind of maximize that. But this was all about just kind of throwing everything against the wall, every single Beatles tune, and really just kind of making the most out of Beatlemania. Towards the end of 1964, they release a movie, a musical documentary, if you will, that essentially recreated their whole American experience. So, A Hard Day's Night. It's not a great movie, but it's a fascinating movie to watch because it's all about kind of reinforcing this idea of the Beatles, of taking their experiences and putting it in this kind of fictionalized form. In fact, you can find examples of the actual Beatles tour, the interviews they gave, and how that was spun into scenes in the movie. So this, in turn, kind of really reinforces the Beatles' persona. So in a very short amount of time, the Beatles quickly kind of ascend to the top of popular culture as a whole. In a lot of ways, it had to do with the fact that they were bringing back some of these old sounds from rock and roll, combined with skiffle, that they had this unusual look to what they were doing. But at the same time, they didn't have to deal with a lot of kind of racialized concerns about early rock and roll. So if you look at the listing of albums I gave you, I think it's the first 4 albums they release, it really shows you kind of what their impact is. So, Please Please Me, as number 1 for 30 weeks straight. By the time that With the Beatles arrives, which is only 8 months later, that is at 21 weeks at number 1. You get A Hard Day's Night that comes out, 21 weeks at number 1, and then Beatles for Sale, which a lot of people consider to be the weakest Beatle album in their entire repertoire. That's still at 11 weeks at number 1. When you look at these 4 albums, though, you also see a trajectory where they start to change as a band. You get less cover songs, you get more original songs. George Harrison starts to write, and he starts to become one of the songwriters alongside Lennon and McCartney. And then by the time you get to Beatles for Sale, you also start to get a shift in lyrical tone. It moves from the early days of the Beatles being, She Loves You, Yeah, 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 to songs during Beatles for Sale, he's a real nowhere man, sitting in his nowhere land, making all of his nowhere plans for nobody. It becomes much more about this kind of introspective sort of approach to songwriting. And this is going to be a pretty kind of significant change for the Beatles. And all of this being put together by the guy who would eventually become their main producer, George Martin. Now, George Martin, as a producer, kind of falls into that role of having that kind of grand vision for how all these songs work, right? The kind of musical overseer in the studio, but he didn't necessarily have that Svengali approach in which he was managing every aspect of what they did. George Martin himself, he was a producer who was used to doing comedy albums, for doing orchestral albums. So when the Beatles would come in with their songs, he would be the one to say, well, let's change the song around a little bit. Let's move this section of the song to later on. Let's experiment with this thing. Let's try a couple different approaches here. Probably one of the most famous examples of his production had to do with John Lennon singing the song, Money, That's What I Want. And apparently they decided they were going to record this at the very end of the session, when John Lennon's voice was just blown out. He was nothing but raspiness. Because that was the sound that George Martin wanted. He wanted that kind of real gritty vocal timbre, and not something that was pretty, that was something nice. So George Martin was the one who had this kind of early vision for what the songs, what the music of the Beatles would sound like.